a few other chapters that I have in there as well that sort of expand on it, whether it's the seven sages after the Atlantean disaster, or it's the echoes that sort of hit the other cultures around the world that stem out of Atlantis that we're going to get into. And actually, Atlantis, even though I don't always talk about it in the book, it is such a significant part of the polytheist belief systems and the polytheist legends and religions that it is actually part of the worldwide legacy that all other cultures have. And again, whether or not we want to recognize it as being part of the flood narrative as monotheists or not, we need to recognize it has pretty much an identical narrative as what the flood story has in Genesis, only again from, as I mentioned, a polytheist perspective. So I think we can talk about it in terms of another perspective on the flood story and connect it to so much other mythology that's out there about Atlantis without worrying about disturbing what it says in Genesis, because again, Genesis is going to be our measurement stick and what we weigh everything against. But I don't find that any of this has a lot to do with what Genesis says, although I'll grant you that sometimes my understanding of Genesis might differ from what other people might think. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm sure many of your listeners may be aware of this, but if those who aren't, the first thing I think people have to be open to when we talk about Atlantis is that there are underwater cities, submerged cities, all around the globe off of almost every continent. And they have an age that dates anywhere from, 5,000 years to 12,000 years when they were built as best as they can identify those. So I think the notion that, and again, whether or not we totally agree with how science dates the history, whether it's carbon dating or layering or whatever else that they want to do to identify how old they think things are, I think we have to look at the trend line and see how that matches up with what it might say in the Bible. And so these ancient cities are inexplicable. They are unaccountable, and even secular science isn't wanting to, and archaeology is not wanting to deal with this in a significant way, because it totally alters the propaganda and the timeline that they've already presented. And yet, so this rewrites the secular and not the polytheist, but the secular perspective of archaeology and science, but not necessarily the religious perspective. And probably everybody's heard of the Azores, that people have thought maybe Atlantis is there, and there's all these different locations. And I'm going to come back to maybe I should put this out on the table first before I zero a little bit more in on Atlantis. Is in the antediluvian world, there was anywhere from polytheist in mythology, anywhere from 4 great civilizations to as many as 9. And I only include 9 because I know there's so many fans out there of the Game of Thrones, and Thrones is just another word for authority or kingship, and it's in the Bible as thrones, principalities. They're archons. They were the celestial mafia that had these cult centers. And the most that I have from, let's say, from Enoch and some other little bit more closely related to monotheism accounts would be 7 cult centers that begin somewhere around 10 to 12,500 BC, where the gods or the fallen angels built these cult centers with great temples and pyramids and things like that, which is why we see them all around the world. And to as little as 4 civilizations, which is more common in the Atlantean mythologies and maybe some of the New Age mythologies. And so some of the names that people will be familiar with these civilizations would be, of course, Atlantis and Sumerius, 2 of them. Mu would be another one. And so certain names like that, even Lemuria, but Lemuria is more looked upon as the motherland of these first civilizations. But again, that really gets deep into theosophy, religion, and mythology. and certainly parts of Egypt. And there's a lot of speculation whether Egypt was a separate empire in the antediluvian world, or was it just a satellite country of Atlantis. So I already mentioned we've got locations around the world with submerged cities, and people are familiar with Bimini and Azores and all of these different speculations. And the reason why they tend to look more into the Atlantic Ocean is it goes back to Plato's account in Critias and Timaeus, where he said that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now, people like to reinvent what the Pillars of Hercules are when they're wanting to locate Atlantis, let's say at Santorini or around Crete or around Manoa, which also had ancient cities and ancient submerged cities, which is part of what I was talking about earlier. But the Pillars of Hercules in the ancient world were known to be beyond what we would know today as the Rocks of Gibraltar and that inlet that goes into the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. So somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And again, according to Plato and other ancient writers, it was somewhere northwest off the North African coast. And I'm going to maybe later in the show I'll finish up with some of the names of the countries and how they link back to Atlantis later on. So most people look in Atlantis, and I know some people will even look as far below as Antarctica, that they believe that there was some sort of crust shift that moved Atlantis and the destruction down to Antarctica and is submerged below the ice. And certainly there's ancient maps that show the island of Antarctica or the continent of Antarctica. That is a total mystery as to how they would know that. But again, most are looking into the Atlantic Ocean. And, and I think people are even familiar with Edward Casey, who thought that Atlantis would be discovered late in the 2000s, or around the 2000 area, or early on into this millennia. But there was an interesting discovery, and it was actually made in the 1960s, and they laid off of it because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's when it was actually covered, and they didn't want this information to fall into the Russian government's hands. And so what's going on now is sort of a revisitation to that site just off of Cuba in the Yucatan Channel, just between sort of Cuba and the Yucatan. And there's two scientists, I think the names are Paul Weinweg and Pauline Zalitsky. And these are all of these fabulous pictures of this gigantic city complex that's located underwater with 4 pyramids, and there's sphinxes, and the size of the rocks used for the construction is incredible. There's roads. They're even saying there's tunnels, and one of the pyramids is a crystal pyramid that they say is larger than the one in Egypt. So we'll have to wait for information to come back on this, but it is certainly in the right area, and when we link it into the Central and South American and the North American mythologies perhaps a little bit later, it makes a lot of sense that it might be there. So if this is not Atlantis, it is another unaccounted for submerged city that dates back about 10,000 years. Again, so that kind of matches up with some of these cities being built by the Watchers in around 10,000 BC.
And we're dealing with similar technologies.
And we're dealing with similar technology, absolutely, which is so key because in case people aren't aware of it, I believe, and all the research that I've done leads me to conclude that the technology and the knowledge level in the pre-flood world was as great as we have today and perhaps greater. So, but our technology and knowledge is developing so rapidly, we'll probably catch up, and it will be exactly like the days of Noah once we catch there. And there's also writing that they're seeing on these rocks that are very similar to hieroglyphs. They haven't decoded them. They're not saying they're exactly like hieroglyphs, but they're very, very much related. And again, that would make sense if Egypt was part of the Atlantean Empire. So that makes a whole lot of sense to me. And so there are so many sites and things that people are saying where Atlantis is. For me, this is sort of the most likely one because it was discovered by the U.S. government. And it's been known about, and now we're getting actual pictures from it. So for me, that's the best case for Atlantis today. But whether or not that turns out to be Atlantis or not, Atlantis is larger than the archaeology of it. It's sort of encapsulates the whole story of prehistory. There's another place that National Geographic is covering off recently, I think is starting in about 2011 or so. That's just off of the coast of Spain, north of Cadiz, and it's a submerged city, and there's a lot of connections there in terms of the archaeological discoveries that they're bringing up that connects it to Greek and Atlantean mythology. And so they're thinking that's the location of Atlantis, which again is possible, but probably more as one of the satellite empires or one of the satellite countries as opposed to the exact location, because Atlantis was so much bigger than just this one country or continent. And there's a map in the 1600s done by Kircher that places, and he said he got his information from ancient maps and ancient information that places Atlantis right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean between Spain and Cuba, and a fairly large continent. Yes, that's what we're talking about it, and the Atlantean ideology and notion and mythological aspect of it has it operating like an antediluvian world empire, much like what was trying to happen in Babylon and empires past and what will happen in the end time. And it's very much an allegory for the end time in so many ways as well. But what's important to know is that there was 10 nations or groups of nations that were part of the Atlantean Empire, and the Atlantis Island was one of those. It was the capital center, and it was known for the helm of world government, and it was on a path to try and take the whole world over through military force and through the Titans. That's why I call it the Nephilim world order, and the kings were Titans and Nephilim. But they were defeated by the Athenians and Hercules, and so they didn't quite get that done. And so some of the nations, if people are wondering where some of these nations were, so it would include, Northwest Africa in two different segments that would include like Libya and Egypt. It would include the other parts of Northwest Africa, which had Morocco involved with it, and right sort of around that whole corner. It included Southwest Europe, including Spain and Southwest France, and as far over as Italy. It included England, Scotland, and the British Isles, and some people think even further up into Iceland and more towards Sweden and Norway, but I don't have anything to confirm that. It also included the various islands within the ocean that are off the west coast of Europe and Africa. It also included the Yucatan of South America and other parts of Central America and parts of South America that would be more in the northern part of South America. And it would, did I get them all? I think so. I think that's pretty much most of the geography that was included in it. So this was a very, very large world empire in the making in the antediluvian mythology. That's the thing to keep in mind is that even though we're mystified and we're talking today about submerged cities in Atlantis, whether or not you go into Machu Picchu or you go into some of these other sites that are ancient and they all said it was built by the builder gods or the senior ones or whatever the allegory for these ancient ones who built them, it's all part of the same mythology, it's all part of the same history and seemingly with related cultures and languages and gods. So I think there's a consistency there that makes a lot of sense. That there's more to it than somebody just coming up and trying to speculate and just connect dots. Because what we're doing, we're connecting the history, because this is what these tribes and peoples and religions think this is actually their history, we're tying different people's histories together with archaeology and the Bible, and we're finding it's telling the same story. That's too much of a coincidence for me. Just to show you how some of these connections work. So everybody's familiar with the country called Ethiopia, but that's on the east coast of Africa. But what people don't know is Ethiopia originally was not located there, and it sort of was moved there, or the name changed during the Merovingian Empire, as I recall. But the ancient Greeks knew Ethiopia as Adiops, and Adiops was the mountain of serpents, which was located in northwest Africa, which is Adiops is the sort of the original name for Ethiopia. And they believed that Adiops was part of and the surviving part of the Atlantean Empire. And again, so you have an etymology that connects us back as well, that goes out through history, that is sort of inexplicable. I mean, when we're talking about, again, it's the mountain of serpents, right? So it goes back to these 7 sacred mountains, right? And then the mountains of the seraphim angels who had this serpent-like look, and the Titans and the Nephilim who look just like them. So the serpent allegory that is connected throughout the world and through everything in Atlantis, or the dragon allegory, is a significant part of this whole understanding of it. And I want to throw one other historian in before we move on, and you may have heard of Belisar, or maybe more commonly known as Berosus, one of these famous ancient writers that was commissioned by the Greeks just after Alexander died to record the history of ancient Mesopotamia and Babylon, and just as Ptolemy commissioned Manetho, if I pronounce that Manetho, some people will pronounce it as, and just as Romans commissioned Josephus to keep the ancient Hebrew history alive, this was a common practice to keep the ancient history flowing. So this was a priest out of the temple of Belus, and his name is either Belisar or Berosus, depending on which language you're translating from, and he wrote a book about called Babylonica, which was the history of Babylon. And he said that the original people who named their city Babylon named it Babylon as a reference and an allegory and a memorial to and a replacement for the first city of the world, the city of cities that was destroyed by the flood, which I believe and Berosus believed was Atlantis. That's what they did, and they went underground, whether it's North American or it's some of the Nephilim mythology that's out there. Of course, along that sort of lines, there's this idea that they put these Nephilim in stasis, and the other beings that, would be some of the lizard people or some of the little people are guarding them for the end time. That's not where I'm going with that, but as a possibility, and just sort of make a link to that's, I think, where some of this mythology comes from, is it is highly possible that some of these cities did survive, except that we have to remember, though, that in the other accounts, and even in the Bible, I can make some reference to widen the story of what the flood is. This was a horrific catastrophe that was more than just water bubbling up from the storage wells below the surface. This was earthquakes, volcanoes, landmass being shifted up and down and turning everything upside down, and meteor strikes. So it's probably more likely, if that's what was going on, they've been rebuilt, but they would have had the technology to be able to do that. But I do want to refer to Ezekiel 26 on that one for people who may want to go and check that verse where it's talking about in ancient times, the people, when the earth was laid bare and people were dwelling underground. So you may want, it's a very odd one, and it's part of that connection to that verses that are describing Satan. So there's something to the effect of something underground, because there's, like it says, people of long ago who dwell in the earth in ancient ruins, just kind of paraphrasing as it comes into my head. So that's a possibility. I don't have anything to assert that that's actually true, but it certainly points in that direction that that's a possibility. Rule it out completely. I can't substantiate it, but there are connections there. And again, if you get into the Atlantean mythology, And after the rebellion, the Titans who rebelled, they're put away into a prison called Tartarus, which is thought to be in the earth. And Tartarus is another name for abyss that Peter uses in some translation of the first book of Peter, as I recall, where it could say Tartarus or it could say abyss. And again, I look at the water, I look at a shaft in the earth for where the abyss might be, and I look at Tartarus, and I say, there's too much of a connection there that suggests that there isn't something that goes on underneath the earth. But again, I don't have enough to be, particularly, determined and definite on that. But I do like the research and the ideology of that there's something going on below the earth. Well, whether or not it comes from, Zep Tepi, motherland, from the Book of Thoth, and they talk about portals, or it comes from the Tartarus idea and the Tuatha De Danann and going to the other world or the netherworld or Anwin and back and forth between these portals, or you have the fairy domens that are located all around the world, which kind of look like little huts of mini Stonehenge sort of buildings, but domen stands for portal, and they call them fairy portals. In the fairy mythology, which I've talked about in other shows with you, that there's a gray alien that has flying machines and kidnaps people and does DNA experimentations, and think it was a gray alien abduction if you saw one of those descriptions. Also come through shays or fairy mounds or portals, and also out of the water and portals. And an allegory for that is the ladies of the lake, which are fairies, because fairies are all part of the Fae group in King Arthur, and they're in the lakes guarding these portals, and that these fairy ladies, fairies were sent to guard the portals to the other world. It's all part of the Gnostic religions. There is such a rich and detailed narrative from so many different aspects of religion and mythology that one has to kind of think there's something to this, to the portals to the underworld, or is it to another dimension? You pick your choice, or maybe it's both, but there's something here that we need to look deeper at and understand better, I think. And whether or not, science is even close to answering the question with quantum physics and string theory and multiple dimensions, that they would suggest by theory there are infinite amount of dimensions and quantum possibilities. I'm not convinced of that, but we already know there are different sort of dimensions, from 2-dimension to 3-dimension and possibly time, and we know from just a religious aspect that the spirit realm is a different dimension, if we want to call it that, than what we're in the physical realm. So I think there's again more to it, and we need to be open but not deceived as to what some of these things might be. So the first thing is that they did have the characteristics, and even in the Atlantean mythology, that of what their fathers looked like. And again, we talked about the seraphim angels who had the face of a snake and looked like a dragon with the wings. And they were shining opalescent beings. And so in the Atlantean mythology, whether it comes from Greek, Egyptian, Central American, or North American, they all agree that they were white. They agree that they had red hair or blue hair, that they had rough, white, ruddy skin, their eyes glowed, they had high cheekbones, and they looked like snakes. So there's a serpent-like quality that they certainly inherited from a physical aspect. So again, why wouldn't they have other aspects that perhaps is changeling quality or perhaps skills because they were some sort of reptilian or fish-like? And when you get into the Sumerian description of the original senior ones that are coming in, they are the Oannes, which were a fish-like god, right? Still look serpent-like, but they said they went back into the sea all the time and came back out. So again, this is Oannes, also started the 7 sages in Sumeria, which is the Sabeti, which is the same as the Shebtiu and the 7 sages around the world that people of mythology, or the 7 rishi out of India would recognize. And Enoch, the evil, is connected to be Oannes, not Oannes, the original god, but Oannes from the followers of Oannes, and takes on that name as well. So, and then there's an etymology connection that I'll show between Oannes and Enoch in my book. But there is a connection there, and just as Zeus is sometimes portrayed in a fish-like or lizard-like or reptilian or a snake-like form, this is not sort of a total it's a total impossibility. It is certainly possible that they would have some of those attributes that their parents did. There's no doubt about it. It's just which ones are they? And so Dagon is the god that the Philistines bring in, and they come in from Crete and Cyprus in the Mediterranean Ocean. So now we've got a Greek connection with a Poseidon-like god, just as most people think Oannes and Poseidon are the same god, right? So whether or not they're actually fish-like or not, or it's an allegory of the god of the sea as opposed to the god of the sky, which Zeus would have been in Greek mythology, right? I think they're talking about the same god, and they're talking about the same mystical religion in Atlantis, which was the Enochian mysticism that Sumeria had. I think they all had the same religion around the world. They just had different gods running the different cult centers, but they had a very similar and pretty much identical pantheon. Yes, because Oannes starts the 10, and 10 is an antediluvian constant as a number, but 10 kingships. They're called the Pishtin kingships, which is so very close in its pronunciation to Poseidon, right? So I think it is the same. Yeah, essentially, although I would raise Poseidon higher than Nimrod, I would raise, because he's so high up in the pantheon, I would certainly insist that he was one of the more senior watchers running the cult centers, and he was certainly in Greek mythology equal to Zeus, right? So again, you have this constant in polytheism where you have two gods. One is a good god, and Zeus is considered a good god and the sky god, and Poseidon is the god of the water and the bad god in most people's view. And so you have the same sort of analogy with Enki and Enlil. So Enlil is the god that is associated with monotheism, and also known as Adonai in the polytheist realm as well for our God, and Enki as the good God. And so I think that is a constant that we have to look at, that he is a very, very high god in charge of one of these cult centers. And Zeus is also the one who causes the flood, just as Enlil is the one who causes the flood in Sumerian mythology. And Poseidon is the one who is the bringer of knowledge to this Atlantean empire, and Zeus is trying to keep the whole empire under rules and regulations. And the same thing happens in Sumeria, where Enki is the one bringing knowledge and looking after the betterment of humankind, and Enlil is trying to enslave them to worship them and doing all these different slanders polytheism likes to do with our God. And so what he does is he marries a person in most legends, and there are different variations of the name. Okay, so in some legends he marries Cleito, or Cleito, Cleito, or in other legends it's Clymene. But it doesn't really matter, it's a human female. And by the way, just as a sidetrack, so we understand how this Poseidon thing overlaps to the Bible and gets confused, is Poseidon also has two other names as an angel, just as some other titans that he created take the same name. And I'm not talking about Atlas here, which is one of the sons of Poseidon, but some other ones, because Poseidon mated with many other human females. But Poseidon also had the name of Japetus and Iapetus, which is the Greek version of Japheth. So the polytheists and the Gnostics want us to believe. It's not. They're two different names. I think Japheth have taken the name of the giants as they went and settled in with his descendants, with Gog and Magog as being other names that would also be taken in a similar way that the descendants of Esau and Amalek in particular took the name of the Amalekites. And so I think that is what's really going on. And what they like to do is they like to convert the name to us just a Greek name for Japheth. And then they overlay all of this polytheist mythology as to what happened to the descendants of Japheth. No, this is different. And Poseidon had those different names. And I think a giant named Japetus or Iapetus was one of the rebellious titans that rebelled and escaped from Tartarus, and same as Gog and Magog were also Greek giant names. And Gog in Egypt in Greek actually means giant or gigantes. Okay, so now Poseidon has 5 twins, 5 male twins. And so these become the 10 kings of the Atlantean Empire. So what happens with that meaning is if they all were born out of one mother in Atlantis, these kings had to usurp the kingships of these other nations. So they were a warring nation right from the beginning. And so that's where the 10 nations come from. And that's where that empire is that we had talked about. Put himself over above all of those cult centers and gods of those cult centers, gods of those pantheons. And I would also mention that, Zeus reigned from where? Mount Olympus. And I'm not saying that to confuse people on geography. I'm just saying that when you talk about the seat of Satan, it's on a mountain, a holy mountain, which is, again, a constant, or a pyramid that's a constant as well in terms of where these fallen angels ruled from, or these 7 cult centers. There's 7 sacred mountains in the world, and that's constant in polytheism, whether it's Taoism or it's Greek mythology. And these mountains are where these gods ruled from. So if we understand those as separate nations and different sort of fallen angels, watchers ruling from there, but having a pantheon that's set up all the same way, and they could also even be all the same gods in the same pantheon, just one rules one area and one rules another area, then I think it starts to make some sense. When you're trying to pull Atlantis, which I do, into the Genesis account, you're actually pulling it from the polytheist belief into a sooner date than a later date, so that they would take an Atlantean destruction probably back to somewhere between 5 to 8,000 BC, and some even further back than that. That's the other possible translation. The King James Version doesn't say that, but if you look back at the Hebrew words that would go in it, like using Strong's dictionaries, it gives you the possible meanings that you could translate that as, and suggest that the earth had become void. But I like to go back to the original Hebrew on it, and there's 2 ways of translating that. And I would also point people to a couple of other verses. Again, look to that verse in Ezekiel 26, where the earth is in ruins, and that is in ancient times, which is antediluvian and even longer, and it's talking about the time of Satan and his fall. So that's a possible reference to it. A lot of people also like to use Jeremiah 4:23 to 26, and again it talks about the earth being void and formless, but I don't really look at that as a reference to Genesis 1, because it seems to be talking about another time than back then. But I would point to Psalm 104:30, and I would have people look at that, because immediately after, if the word had become void, and in verse 2 it talks about the Spirit hovering over the earth. And in 104:30 it talks about the creation of the world and the Spirit renewing the earth. And that's the renewal theory or the gap theory that people are referring to. So I think there's a strong possibility that that's the case. And just as there's a strong argument that the people of Day 6 is a significantly different story than the Eden account. And again, I have a little over 2-page document. If people want to email me or get a hold of me, I'll send that to you, because it's a show in itself to cover off that. The story between 6 and Eden account is completely different, and I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction. So if you have these 2 possibilities, you have the gap theory that people like to call it, which we don't know how old the world gets to be, and then you have some time, an unknown period of time, between Day 6 and the creation of Adam in singular, and I'll just leave that as absolutely. We've let science interfere with what the Bible actually says, and we just don't let the Bible read for what it says. So we become more skeptical and conservative of that. And, if I didn't find so many issues between the Day 6 people and the Eden account, I may not put as much credence on the gap theory. But because both of those things answer so many different questions, like when did the angelic rebellion happen? And why did it happen? And if these were immortal beings, why would it have happened so quickly, right? So just puts things in better context for me to look at that as a significant possibility. And I have to admit, I lean like 99% and leaving that 1% open that I'm wrong on it. But I'd underline that the only thing that suggests that the world is 6,000 years old is taking the genealogies back to Adam. And if Adam is created at a different time than the people created in plural who are nomadic hunters and gatherers and a whole bunch of other differences in the story between Day 6 and Eden 2, then all of a sudden we're freed up from these chains of when the Earth was actually created, and because it's not a big deal, right? When we look at the mythology, the two best ones to look at are descriptions from Plato, and then match that up with people like Homer and Plutarch, because they talked about Titans, not specifically Atlantis, but Titans as a whole in that whole mythology. And so all of them are pretty much consistent in terms of what they say happened. So understand that when Athens defeated Atlantis in the battle against Atlantis, that there were Titans fighting for the Athenians. Okay, so at first, after usurping the leadership of these Titan kings, these demigods, these giants who looked like serpents, and then afterwards they produced more Nephilim kings. But in the beginning, they call it the Golden Age, and they call it the age of judicial rule by these very powerful, shining Nephilim kings, and that they ruled judiciously and they created peaceful societies. But over time, and after they developed the religions and they developed these technologies, they're able to trade around the world. They're able to communicate around the world. They're able to have flying machines. They're able to do DNA manipulation. They're able to do all of the things and more than what we can do today. And we're told it was just a place of pleasure. And then the kings, they slowly, because they say the aspects of humanity, and this can happen in two ways, start to overtake these judicious, godlike, good beings who are ruling. Now understand, this is their description. This is not my interpretation. This is what they say, not what I believe. But they said that humanity, through intermarriage and bloodlines and interaction, gaining power over them with the evil, and the good side was being slowly eaten away. So two things going on. One is that angels and Titans and everybody's affected by the evil of this world. So even if they started off good, they're being affected by the world. And sin is what we know it because the world is sin. Or the second thing is that they're talking about is through the generations, through the different kings coming to power, that they were intermarrying more with humans and more bloodlines being interjected, and they became more evil all the time. And that they started to realize that their immortality was waning, which goes back to Genesis 6 again, with God intervening and saying, we are not going to permit earthly gods to live forever in the flesh on the earth. So he limits lifespan to 120 years. And the original ones, they lived for a long period of time, yes, but their bodies die out and they become demons because the spirit doesn't go to sleep and they're not allowed to go into heaven. But the descendants, even though they can live to be a long age, they know that they're no longer immortal. And then they start to war. They start to do more black magic. They're trying to do everything they can to create longevity. So this is the elixir of life and immortality that's been perpetuated through the Rosicrucians and vampire tales, and they drink blood, and they do all sorts of abominations, and they start to turn against the earth in their wrath. And they're so upset about their mortality that this is where hero worship comes from in Greek mythology or in Taoism, where the spirit of their hero or their ruler would come back to where they reigned, and they used to sacrifices to them to pacify this angry spirit, because he would come back and haunt the local town or the city that he had ruled over. And so it moves into this debauchery of sexual violations, of destroying and corrupting the earth, of drinking blood, and then they also turn on humans because they can no longer feed the number of giants in the world, that their appetites are so huge. This is according to Enoch, that they turn on humans and start to slaughter them and start to eat them. Then they turn on each other, and so they turn this golden age that they call it, Zep Tepi, age of Aquarius, whatever you want to call it. That's the future reference allegory for the golden age. And they start to war with each other, and then the gods bring on the flood after they put down the rebellion against the gods and start all over. That is what happens in the Greek and polytheist records, and again, look to Plutarch to describe that as well in particular detail in how that world slides into depravity. It's really, really important, particularly with what you just said. So I already talked about the development of the science and the technology. That's the seven sacred sciences of Enoch the Evil and Freemasonry and craft legends, right? And we also know Francis Bacon was part of secret societies, and we'll get into that in a second. But the development of these seven sacred sciences were what led to the development of mysticism and black magic, which overtook the Atlantean Empire. It went from good magic, as they would call it, into black magic, as in sorcery and necromancy aspects. And so this mystical side is the priesthood. This is the Babylonian part. It's always in partnership with the Nephilim-ruled kingships, or the Antichrist-type figure of kingships. Okay, and the priests are known as wizards and or magi or as wise ones. You know all the different names, and that's why you have wizards connected to Francis Bacon, and that's why wizards show up in Atlantean mythology or related ones, whether it's Merlin and King Arthur, because Merlin is a title for a priest and is the partner of King Arthur. That's a whole different story in its show in itself. And also you have the Magi, and the wise ones, and the astrologers from Nimrod's empire that comes out of Babel. And you have Hermes, who's the priest and the wise one, and the Magi, who works with Nimrod in partnership at Babel, and he goes over to Egypt, and he starts the Egyptian religion and the Egyptian priesthood. So you see this sort of consistency of this religious aspect, which is also important to understand that in the end time, you have a universal religion that is controlling this end-time empire called Babylon. This is very much what happened with the kings. They were controlled by this mystical wizard sorcery-type religion. So now that is backdrop. Let's move into Shakespeare and Francis Bacon. So there is a lot of talk that Shakespeare and Francis Bacon are the same individual, and there's some good reasons. I'll just give you a few because there's so many of them. So Shakespeare is the son of a butcher, and he's uneducated, and he writes the great classics of that period of time that are even recognized even today. He has a knowledge that is unaccountable for the classics in ancient history. He has a knowledge of the legal system of that time. Everything is perfectly written, legalistically right. He has a knowledge of the courts and the royal courts in a way that a commoner wouldn't have. He has the writing style of Oxford, which he never received a formal education, and he uses words that are being reinvented and reapplied at that time, and he uses Rosicrucian, secret society, occultic symbols that he has no business in understanding, right? You have all of these, and those are just the tip of the iceberg of the things that say, how could Shakespeare have done this? Okay? And you have the name Shakespeare, which everybody thinks is made up. and it's an allegory. Now, let's just move over to Bacon, and this is one of the most powerful people in England, and he works and he's trained under John Dee, who's the most famous occultist of his era, at least from an English perspective, and actually takes over for John Dee in a lot of the societies and that later on. So when Francis Bacon is young, he is writing things as they go through their sort of elite lifestyles for the courts, and they're learning about things, and he becomes a prolific writer. But he doesn't stop this, and he does this when he goes over at an early age, I think in his teens, over to France. And he comes back to England, and he wants to continue his writing, but he really can't, because he's basically the second in charge, or will be the second in charge of in England during the time of Elizabeth and Henry VIII, and even with Mary, I guess, there for a couple of years. So he creates this society called the Society of the Helmet. And these are all literary people, and they're going to write things, and they're going to try and bind a common English language, and they're going to reinvent words, and they're going to put out all this stuff. So he employs, I don't know how many, I can't remember, but a significant number of playwrights. And it's called the Society or the Brotherhood of the Helmet. What's important about that is there's a goddess and a god that are related to this helmet, and that's Athena and Apollo. And they would wear this helmet over their face, and they would also have a spear. And they would help educate the people and bring knowledge, and they would shake the spear in the face of the evil one, or the dragon, or the evil god of the universe, as they would call our god, for teaching the illicit language. And so originally the name Shakespeare was hyphenated, Shake-Spear, and then they joined it together. And so this is the society of literary agents that he creates, which has the name Shakespeare in it. And I think that's the name that's given and adopted by this perhaps even mythical person that they created a history on called Shakespeare. So if it's not Lord Bacon, I don't know where he gets all of this Rosicrucian and ancient history from, because the world of the Globe Theater was known as a Rosicrucian theater. And the works of Shakespeare are loaded with the genealogies of the bloodlines of the Nephilim and the kingships. And it's loaded with the allegories of the Nephilim and the giants. And it's loaded with the allegories of both the patriarchal and the matriarchal line. And that's why you have all of these fairies that are in there. And so you even have the king of the fairies, which is King Oberon, which connects back to the Tuatha De Danann and through the Celtic kingships, which is, again, another show in itself. But the king of the fairies is married to who? Titandes. That's a female name for Titan. This is all allegory of the dark side and a history with genealogies and bloodlines and hidden history and hidden meanings. And there's no way Shakespeare could have had all of that knowledge. That was a bit of a rant, but that gives you an idea what we're talking about. Let's just move back a little bit. So there was an organization called the Templars that knew about North America, and it was their dream to continue to discover what was over there and bring it along, and this is a longer-term plan. And what's important about that is even Columbus on his main ship bore on the Santa Maria the Templar flag, and there were some of the money behind him going, because they knew it was there. They just wanted to get this thing going. So this was part of a Templar dream, but the Templars are overthrown in 1307. So I'm moving quickly to get back into it. They form a number of organizations that Francis Bacon inherits in the, say, I think he was 1540 to about 1625. I think that's when Bacon lived, somewhere in that zone. So in that period of time. So these groups are, the Freemasonic group are recreated to do the political and the military and media and stuff like that influence. You have the Rothschilds that are created for the banking arm of the Templars. You have the Royal Society, which I'll come back to, which is going to take control of education and develop the seven sacred sciences for the great architect of the universe, or Lucifer as they like to call him. and you have the Jesuits who need to replace the Templars inside the Catholic Church as a Catholic military role that works at the front and center of whatever Catholicism is doing. And, of course, you have the Rosicrucians, and you have the Illuminati, both who are heavily involved with all of the secret societies. And the Illuminati is all about world government and destroying Christianity, and Rosicrucianism is about keeping the Gnostic religion, keeping the legends and the mythology, and it includes alchemy, which, of course, Francis Bacon was. So he wrote several alchemy books, for lack of trying to get the other word out, and he finished up with this alchemy philosophy, which is part of the seven sacred sciences, that goes into the New Atlantis. The New Atlantis is a book about the end time, or a new golden age, or a new age, or the New Atlantis, as he calls it, which is based upon a society that is a recreation of the Atlantean age, where you have a world government and you have a world religion that works in harmony with science. And, of course, it's the ancient religion out of Atlantis. It's the Enochian mysticism. It's Babylon. It's polytheism. And that's why it works in harmony with science, because the Royal Society is created to develop the sciences. And these are created by Freemasons and Rosicrucians. And Francis Bacon is the inspirational founder from his writing of the New Atlantis for the establishment of the Royal Society. Now, getting back to the U.S., so you've got Walter Raleigh, who works with Francis Bacon in the development and the ongoing development of the Americas. And, of course, the Jesuits are always, coincidentally, accompanying these ships, because they're all working for the same sort of end, to develop Brazil and the United States, because they had a twin hope of developing those as role models and springboards for what the end time government and world will look like. And so the envision of this is many states, and 13, which is an occultic number, were the original 13 colonies. No coincidence there, but it actually is a design thing, but just understand they overlay everything with their meanings. And so this is going to work from a strong federal government with independent states that work together for one common cause. And each of the governments will have their own responsibilities, but the central government will do things like foreign policy and healthcare and education, sort of things that affect everybody. And I know they didn't look at it in quite those terms, but just in modern terms, that was how it was supposed to be set up. And you look at how the U.S. works today and how poorly the EEC is working. So they need to get back to more of a UN or a United States model, but that was the springboard and the model. And the U.S. was built to help bring their idea of limited democracy, and they don't really care what the form of government is in the end, as long as they get what they want. But it's United States Manifest Destiny, which is their philosophy, their idea, because destiny and fairies are all interlinked, right? Understand that these words that are used by everyday Americans and Canadians and people around the world are placed and utilized just as fellows are, because a fellow is a member of one of these secret societies. So anytime you sing Jolly Good Fellow, you're singing a secret society song. So anyways, they are utilizing the United States as this springboard, and their manifest destiny is not only to be a modern force, but to help usher in world government. Unfortunately, stubborn Christians are in the way. That's the problem. And so they created the United States with a constitution that wasn't designed to protect Christians so much as it was designed to protect their Gnostic religion from the wrath of the Roman Church. And the Constitution has been written in a way to be eventually used against Christians, which we're starting to see today. So they're going to use this against us in the end time. And what's interesting about this as a model for world government is we had mentioned that Atlantis had 10 nations as part of its helm of world government. And Daniel in Revelation prophesied a 10-nation empire. And in the late 60s and the early 70s, one of these spring-off organizations that all starts with the Templars and Bacon as one of the major influences is the Club of Rome. And these are very high-level bloodlines and very high-level, probably pure bloodline Rosicrucians. And they decide that they're going to solve the world problems, and in doing so, they're going to cattle herd everybody into the end time that they have split up into 10 empires and nations or groups of nations. So what they're trying to set up is 10 economic zones, 10 trading blocks, 10 spheres of influence, 10 groups of nations, however you want to call it, to be this Atlantean empire. So all of this has been planned for such a long period of time, and I've just sort of skimmed top to bottom, so you can jump in anywhere where you want to dig deeper on this, Justin. Absolutely, and I think and although we don't really know about this, although perhaps it's Orion, who is the leader like Antichrist in the antediluvian world. And Orion is connected to the flood story in the Bible as well as in Greek mythology and around the world, whether you're looking at the belts of the pyramid, which are, in their belief system, a monument to the antediluvian world and their great heights that they reached to, or it's Orion that is chasing after the daughters of the Pleiades, and the Pleiades is an allegory of a celestial star system where the 2 or 3, depending on which legend you're talking about, stars hit the oceans, which kick off the flood catastrophes, and Orion is the hunter that's hunting those 2 or 3 daughters, and Pleiades is the daughter of Atlas, who is the king of Atlantis, of the main center. And so when you talk about Orion and Pleiades, they are in all the mythology stories around the world. And in fact, at Babel, where they're building what I believe was the pyramid, because pyramid, tower, or ziggurat meant the same thing in the ancient world, built a little bit differently, but still trying to create a sacred mountain. When you get into the Sumerian, which they said Babel was built at Eridu, and in the Armenian mythologies, they have this temple built at the base of the Tower of Babel, and similarly, they have the same temple built in the Aztec and the Chula and some other Central American mythologies about the building of the Tower of Babel, and when you read them, are almost identical, again, from a polytheist perspective. But they had this temple at the base dedicated to the meteors that started the flood catastrophe that hit the ocean's waters, and those were the Pleiades in all of those legends around the world. Those are just unaccountable coincidences, but we also need to understand that in the Bible, there's connections to Pleiades and the Orion to a flood-like catastrophe, and that comes up in Job 38, Job 9, Amos 5, and in a few more areas in the Psalms. So I think there's a connection there that goes back to it. So yes, there would be a Antichrist-type figure that ruled the antediluvian world. You have a false prophet-type figure that's allegorized in the wizards, and you have the 7 sacred sciences and technology being developed, and you have this 10-nation empire, and you have the same thing that happens with the spirit of the Antichrist and the spirit of the beast, the post-diluvian world, starting with Hermes and Nimrod at Babel trying to do the same thing. And anytime you have a kingship, he has royal bloodlines that goes back to, for the most part, to the Nephilim, and they're trying to recreate the same thing all the way through. They just haven't been successful because the restrainer is holding them back. But in the end time, I believe we're going to see these direct connections back to the antediluvian epoch, back to what some of the things that polytheism tells us, and we're going to find that it matches up perfectly with Bible prophecy. It's a distinct possibility. I think that these 10 kings, just as the Antichrist, has to be connected back to the Nephilim. So they are either descendants with bloodlines, or they are new recreations through copulation, or there's going to be cloning through ancient blood, like we hear of other. They've discovered, I think, Osiris's tomb or Akhenaten's tomb and Nimrod's tomb. I think there's some thoughts out there about that. Or the other possibility is maybe some of these are in stasis, but that's getting too far out. Well, they're not. They're in stasis in underground tubes, or for how long. I do believe that these 10 kings, from one of these sources, are going to be created this way, and it's just a matter of which way they're going to be. But if we go sort of literally to, or they're going to be possessed, which was the other one. There'll be like an avatar concept, which is a distinct possibility. But I also think there'll be bloodlines, or there'll be Nephilim. Because the abyss is going to be open, and all of the fallen angels that were impassioned are going to be back with us again. So everything is in play. We just don't know which one is going to be like the days of Noah. I mean, because the days of Noah could also mean just like it was with Nimrod and Hermes at Babel, because Noah was still alive then. They're very, very similar. The outcome's kind of similar in terms of what they were doing, but somehow, some way, Nephilim are going to be represented in these king rulers and in the Antichrist. I mean, they're talking about doing something that is a creation of recreating immortality. Like, you're talking about just the survival of the spirit and the physical shell being just a vessel, right?
Right.
And so this is a step way beyond demon possession for these spirits. This is about living and making contact and controlling the body and not sharing the body as a vessel. And this is a very, very sort of little-known sort of understanding of a couple of key passages in the New Testament. And let me just, as an extension of this avatar concept, because this is the Rosicrucian concept that avatars are people that they speak to, but these avatars are always looking to possess bodies and own these bodies, and that's behind what they believe a lot of the genetic and transhuman experiments that and research that you referred to are behind. So if we go to Jude 1:6, and of course anybody who's really familiar with the Nephilim story, they go to Jude 1:6 and we see where these angels they left their inhabitants, and it's the word habitant that I want to focus on. And habitant comes back to the Greek word oikaterion, which is like it's like these angels left their spiritual realm. They put on physical clothes, took off their spiritual clothes, and went into this vessel of a body in the physical realm. And if you look at the definition of oikaterion, it is a dwelling space or a body for a spirit. It's a very, very important word, because if you go back to 2 Corinthians 5, 1-2, it's the only other place where you have the Greek word oikaterion used in the New Testament again. And it's got to do with the spiritual inhabitant or the spiritual house of God that we're groaning and desiring to put on those clothes to be in heaven, in that house. And that's where the word oikaterion is used, is in the house, in that application. So it's only used twice in the Bible. And again, that's defined as putting your clothes on. There's a couple other Greek words, or taking your clothes off. There's a couple of very, very close Greek words there, enemu or endo. I can't quite remember what they are, but oikaterion is what the clothes that they're putting on and off. And so that's the avatar concept. And if you extend what we're talking about to ideally what they would love to do in the avatar concept is create these human vessels like they have in the Avatar movie for these demons that are going to be released, or these fallen angels that are going to be released to dwell and be the 10 kings and other rulers in the end time. And what's important there is I don't believe that they'll have, although they're going to work on it with AI, but I don't think they'll crack it. I don't think they have the ability to create a spirit.
No.
Artificially, right?
I'm with you on that.
So they need to put that spirit in, right?
Yep.
So, and again, I just looked it up while you were talking, and just so I've got it right for the listeners, is oiketerion, dwelling place or body for the spirit. That's an avatar concept. It's O-Y-K-A-Y-T-A, well, this is how, at least phonetically, how you would pronounce it, O-Y-K-A-Y-T-A-Y-R-E-E-O-N. Oiketerion. And so if you look into Strong's, you can look that up. And when you look under habitation in June 1:6 and in house in 5:2, 2 Corinthians 5:2. And the clothes were endu, E-N-D-U-O, and unclothed is ekduo, E-K-D-U-O. And it's putting on and off in reference to these spiritual and physical bodies.
And that's what this is. This is the recreation of that.
Yeah, and the reason why I got into that is I wanted to find, and somebody said, look at this word, and I wanted to find a better connection on a changeling quality. Why angels have the ability to take a gender and have a changeling quality. It's because they put on a different set of clothes when they enter into the physical realm. And this is how they have this changeling quality. And they're affected by the physical realm when they put on the physical clothing, just as you're affected by the spiritual realm when you put on the spiritual clothing. And it answers, again, how Nephilim are able to have the changeling quality and we're able to have sex, even though it's a violation against creation companies. But what you're really talking about is the advancement that most people don't understand, and it has the ability to almost create anything. And it's called quantum mechanics. But this quantum computer, there's 4 or 5 of them in the world now. It makes a supercomputer look like a calculator from the early 1970s, and I'm being nice to it. They have the ability over 10 times now, with the last numbers I heard, that they can, the quantum capability of this computer has the ability to record every particle in the universe more than 10 times. And they keep adding to it all the time. And so it has the ability, I mean, we can't understand what this can do, because take a supercomputer that would take like 500 years to calculate something, this thing can do it in less than a second, because they're trying to create a number of things. One of them is artificial intelligence, and the recording of all information, period, whether it is, as we understand it today, as a memory, which we can't reach out and touch, or it's something that is physical. They're reaching into both realms. And they also have the ability, if you carry that further with quantum mechanics, to change things, because it's dealing with all the different universes. And it deals with time, because when you're dealing with dimension, you're also dealing with time. So, and I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but what I do know is to make this computer work, they have to keep it so cold there's nothing in the universe that could keep it that cold to function, but they've been able to create the temperature to do this. And this is also connected in this type of computing system in with CERN. And so all of these developments are going in a similar direction, and which I think is the end time. And I think very, very similar ideas and technologies that would have happened, before the flood and in Atlantis. And so when we're talking about technology that went beyond what we have today, we're probably getting in the same zone. It's just that most people don't see the technology that they're holding back. And whether or not they fulfill that or not, I think it would be limited to who they wanted, to probably people who descend back to the giants. Because what they're offering, and why people will take the mark, not just to survive, but to take the mark, is I believe they're going to offer what Satan promised in the Garden of Eden, that you can be like God. And there's 2 aspects to being a God in their belief system. One is immortality. So this will offer continual bodies and immortality outside of God. And 2 is knowledge and the discipline and understanding of knowledge and enlightenment, so that you harness the knowledge for good, which is the second aspect of godhood in their belief system. That's what they're going to offer. Genesis6conspiracy.com. Go to buy now, then buy from author, and if you want it personalized in any way, you can put information in how you would like it personalized or shipped to another person as well. And, and I think people are even familiar with Edward Casey, who thought that Atlantis would be discovered late in the 2000s, or around the 2000 area, or early on into this millennia. But there was an interesting discovery, and it was actually made in the 1960s, and they laid off of it because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's when it was actually covered, and they didn't want this information to fall into the Russian government's hands. And so what's going on now is sort of a revisitation to that site just off of Cuba in the Yucatan Channel, just between sort of Cuba and the Yucatan. And there's two scientists, I think the names are Paul Weinweg and Pauline Zalitsky. And these are all of these fabulous pictures of this gigantic city complex that's located underwater with 4 pyramids, and there's sphinxes, and the size of the rocks are used for the construction is incredible. There's roads. They're even saying there's tunnels, and one of the pyramids is a crystal pyramid that they say is larger than the one in Egypt. So we'll have to wait for information to come back on this, but it is certainly in the right area, and when we link it into the Central and South American and the North American mythologies perhaps a little bit later, it makes a lot of sense that it might be there. So if this is not Atlantis, it is another unaccounted for submerged city that dates back about 10,000 years. Again, so that kind of matches up with some of these cities being built by the Watchers in around 10,000 BC.
And we're dealing with similar technologies.
And we're dealing with similar technology, absolutely, which is so key because in case people aren't aware of it, I believe, and all the research that I've done leads me to conclude that the technology and the knowledge level in the pre-flood world was as great as we have today and perhaps greater. So, but our technology and knowledge is developed. And so certain names like that, even Lemuria, but Lemuria is more looked upon as the motherland of these first civilizations. But again, that really gets deep into theosophy, religion, and mythology. And certainly parts of Egypt, and there's a lot of speculation whether Egypt was a separate empire in the antediluvian world, or was it just a satellite country of Atlantis. So I already mentioned we've got locations around the world with submerged cities, and people are familiar with Bimini and Azores and all of these different speculations. The reason why they tend to look more into the Atlantic Ocean is it goes back to Plato's account in Critias and Timaeus, where he said that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now, people like to reinvent what the Pillars of Hercules are when they're wanting to locate Atlantis, let's say at Santorini or around Crete or around Manoa, which also had ancient cities and ancient submerged cities, which is part of what I was talking about earlier. But the Pillars of Hercules in the ancient world were known to be beyond what we would know today as the Rocks of Gibraltar and that inlet that goes into the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. So somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And again, according to Plato and other ancient writers, it was somewhere northwest off the North African coast. And I'm going to give you later in the show, I'll finish up with some of the names of the countries and how they link back to Atlantis later on. So most people look in Atlantis, and I know some people will even look as far below as Antarctica, that they believe that there was some sort of crust shift that moved Atlantis and the destruction down to Antarctica and is submerged below the ice. And certainly there's ancient maps that show the island of Antarctica or the continent of Antarctica. That is a total mystery as to how they would know that. But again, most are looking into the Atlantic opening so rapidly, we'll probably catch up and it will be exactly like the days of Noah once we catch there. And there's also writing that they're seeing on these rocks that are very similar to hieroglyphs. They haven't decoded them. They're not saying they're exactly like hieroglyphs, but they're very, very much related. And again, that would make sense if Egypt was part of the Atlantean Empire. So that makes a whole lot of sense to me. And so there are so many sites and things that people are saying where Atlantis is. For me, this is sort of the most likely one because it was discovered by the U.S. government. And it's been known about, and now we're getting actual pictures from it. So for me, that's the best case for Atlantis today. But whether or not that turns out to be Atlantis or not, Atlantis is larger than the archaeology of it. It's sort of encapsulates the whole story of prehistory. There's another place that National Geographic is covering off recently, I think is starting in about 2011 or so. That's just off of the coast of Spain, north of Cadiz. And it's a submerged city, and there's a lot of connections there in terms of the archaeological discoveries that they're bringing up that connects it to Greek and Atlantean mythology. And so they're thinking that's the location of Atlantis, which again is possible, but probably more as one of the satellite empires or one of the satellite countries as opposed to the exact location, because Atlantis was so much bigger than just this one country or continent. And there's a map in the 1600s done by Kircher that places, and he said he got his information from ancient maps and ancient information that places Atlantis right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean between Spain and Cuba, and a fairly large continent. Yes, that's what we're talking about it, and the Atlantean ideology and notion and mythological aspect of it has it operating like an antediluvian. A few other chapters that I have in there as well that sort of expand on it, whether it's the seven sages after the Atlantean disaster or it's the echoes that sort of hit the other cultures around the world that stem out of Atlantis that we're going to get into. And actually, Atlantis, even though I don't always talk about it in the book, it is such a significant part of the polytheist belief systems and the polytheist legends and religions that it is actually part of the worldwide legacy that all other cultures have. And again, whether or not we want to recognize it as being part of the flood narrative as monotheists or not, we need to recognize it has pretty much an identical narrative as what the flood story has in Genesis, only again from, as I mentioned, a polytheist perspective. So I think we can talk about it in terms of another perspective on the flood story and connect it to so much other mythology that's out there about Atlantis without worrying about disturbing what it says in Genesis, because again, Genesis is going to be our measurement stick and what we weigh everything against. But I don't find that any of this has a lot to do with what Genesis says, although I'll grant you that sometimes my understanding of Genesis might differ from what other people might think. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm sure many of your listeners may be aware of this, but if those who aren't, the first thing I think people have to be open to when we talk about Atlantis is that there are underwater cities, submerged cities, all around the globe off of almost every continent. And they have an age that dates anywhere from, 5,000 years to 12,000 years when they were built as best as they can identify those. So I think the notion that, and again, whether or not we totally agree with how science dates the history, whether it's carbon dating or layering or whatever else that they want to do to identify how old they think things are, I think we have to look at the trend line and see how that matches up with what it might say in the Bible. And so these ancient cities are inexplicable. They are unaccountable, and even secular science isn't wanting to, and archaeology is not wanting to deal with this in a significant way because it totally alters the propaganda and the timeline that they've already presented. And yet, so this rewrites the secular and not the polytheist, but the secular perspective of archaeology and science, but not necessarily the religious perspective. And probably everybody's heard of the Azores, that people thought maybe Atlantis is there, and there's all these different locations. And I'm going to come back to maybe I should put this out on the table first before I zero a little bit more on Atlantis. Is in the antediluvian world, there was anywhere from polytheist in mythology, anywhere from 4 great civilizations to as many as 9. And I only include 9 because I know there's so many fans out there of the Game of Thrones, and thrones is just another word for authority or kingship, and it's in the Bible as thrones, principalities. They're archons. They were the celestial mafia that had these cult centers. And the most that I have from, let's say, from Enoch and some other little bit more closely related to monotheism accounts would be 7 cult centers that begin somewhere around 10 to 12,500 BC, where the gods or the fallen angels built these cult centers with great temples and pyramids and things like that, which is why we see them all around the world. And to as little as 4 civilizations, which is more common in the Atlantean mythologies and maybe some of the New Age mythologies. And so some of the names that people will be familiar with these civilizations would be, of course, Atlantis and Sumerius, 2 of them. Mu would be another one.